Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. When I was young, back in my 20s, I was stationed in Vietnam, assigned to a unit responsible for securing and surveying towns after they had been reclaimed. It was a different time, and the war had left its ugly mark on every village, every town we passed. But there was one town, a place shrouded in both silence and eerie unease that I'll never forget. We were a group of 6, all hardened by the war and the battles we'd faced. We weren't afraid of what we might find in the wreckage of these towns anymore, or so we thought. My close friend at the time, Roger, was one of those guys who always tried to lighten the mood. But even he had grown quiet when we got the briefing. This mission was different. We were to enter a town recently recaptured by our forces, secure the area, and stay for 3 days, 2 nights, before reporting back. The name of the town, it had long been erased from any map. The locals called it the City of Ghosts. That should have been the first warning. We began our journey at dawn, trudging through the remnants of villages that had been torn apart, charred and hollow. The road leading into the town was lined with abandoned vehicles, homes riddled with bullet holes, and what could only be described as silent graveyards. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. Roger, Charlie, Sam, Paul, Frank, and I marched in silence, our footsteps crunching against the dirt roads. As we neared the outskirts of the town, something strange caught my eye. The bodies scattered across the streets looked almost fresh, untouched by the ravages of time. But their faces, they seemed frozen in shock, some with hands outstretched, as if trying to reach out for help that never came. We weren't new to seeing death, but this felt different and natural. The old hotel we were assigned to was barely standing. Half of its walls had crumbled away, leaving gaping holes that revealed the skeletal remains of what once were elegant rooms. Dust clung to the air, and the eerie quiet of the town seeped into the building itself. As we entered, the floorboards creaked beneath our boots, but there was no sign of life. It felt as though the entire town had been frozen in time. The hotel lobby was surprisingly intact, with old chairs and tables scattered about, some still covered in soot and dust. Roger dropped his pack onto one of the chairs and gave a low whistle. "Not exactly 5-star. Huh," he said with a grin, but I could see the tension in his eyes. Frank, always the practical one, was quick to assign rooms. 2 to a room, we keep watch in shifts. No one goes off alone. Nah, in this place, we nodded in agreement. The tension was palpable. That first night, we barely slept. The walls seemed to breathe with us, the groaning of the building almost like whispers. I was paired with Charlie, a quiet man, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Somewhere past midnight, I heard a soft knock at the door. I shot up in my bed, heart racing, thinking it was one of the guys. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time in years, I felt truly afraid. Charlie had heard it too, but neither of us said anything. We just stayed up, alert, until morning broke. We headed out to do our reconnaissance early the next day, moving carefully through the maze of shattered buildings and desolate streets. But everywhere we went, we felt eyes on us. It wasn't until we reached the town square that we saw something that made my blood run cold. A woman, standing still in the middle of the road. She was dressed in a torn white dress, her eyes hollow and vacant. "Ma'am," Roger called out, cautiously approaching her. But she didn't respond. She didn't move. As he got closer, he froze. "Jesus," he whispered, stepping back. Her body, though standing, was cold, lifeless. It was as though she had died on her feet, trapped in the final moments of her life, still waiting for something that never came. We didn't touch her. None of us wanted to. As we continued to explore the town, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of our vision, and strange sounds echoed through the streets, footsteps that weren't ours, distant whispers that none of us could place. The worst part, we hadn't seen a single living soul since we arrived, only the dead. At night, back at the hotel, we gathered to discuss what we had seen. The tension was thick, and the fear we all felt was becoming impossible to ignore. "This place, it's wrong," Sam finally said, breaking the silence. "It's like the dead here don't know they're dead." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Something about this town, its silence, the way the bodies were frozen in time felt like a nightmare we couldn't wake from. And as we settled in for another sleepless night, we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that crumbling hotel. The dead, it seemed, still had stories to tell. In this opening episode, a group of 6 soldiers, led by the narrator's grandfather, embark on a mission to secure a reclaimed town during the Vietnam War. Upon arrival, they find the town eerily still, with bodies scattered throughout the streets as if frozen in time. They settle into a crumbling hotel, but strange occurrences soon start to unravel as the soldiers realize that the dead may not be as silent as they seem. The second day in the town began like the first and easy. The sun barely pierced through the dense clouds that hovered over the abandoned streets, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in every corner. We gathered outside the hotel, the same unease from the night before lingering in our minds. Roger and I were assigned to patrol the southern part of the town, while Frank, Sam, Charlie, and Paul took the northern side. Our mission was straightforward: secure the perimeter and report anything suspicious. But after what we'd seen the day before, everything felt suspicious. As Roger and I made our way through the streets, we passed by homes that had once been filled with life. The windows were shattered, the doors barely hanging on their hinges. It was as though time had simply stopped. But it was the silence that gnawed at me the most. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our boots crunching on the rubble-strewn road. We didn't speak much as we moved deeper into the town. There wasn't much to say. Every now and then, Roger would stop and point out something strange: a window with curtains still drawn, as if the occupants were waiting to return, or a car parked on the side of the road with its door ajar, untouched by looters or soldiers. It was as if the town had been frozen at the exact moment it fell. Halfway through our patrol, we came across a small church. The structure was mostly intact, though the roof had partially collapsed. The doors were slightly open, and I felt a strange pull to go inside. Roger seemed to feel it too, because he gave me a nod, and we cautiously entered. The interior was dimly lit, the light filtering through the broken stained glass windows, casting eerie, multicolored shadows on the floor. The pews were still in place, and at the far end, the altar stood covered in dust. But what caught my eye was something else: a figure, sitting in the front pew. At first, I thought it was another one of those frozen bodies like we'd seen the day before. But then it moved. "Who's there?" Roger called out, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. The figure didn't respond at first. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his head bowed as if in prayer. Slowly, he raised his head and turned to look at us. His eyes were wide, empty, hollow. I stayed behind. He muttered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't leave. Roger and I exchanged glances. This was the first living person we'd seen since arriving in the town, but something about him felt off. He didn't seem afraid of us, didn't seem to care that we were soldiers in the middle of a war zone. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked cautiously. The man turned back toward the altar. "They told us to go, but I couldn't. My family, they're still here." Roger took a step forward. "Where's your family?" "We haven't seen anyone." The man slowly stood up, his movements sluggish, like he hadn't moved in days. He pointed toward the back of the church. "They're here, all of them." We followed his gaze, but there was nothing, just an empty corner, filled with shadows. My heart began to race as the silence in the room grew heavier. "They don't know they're gone," the man whispered. "None of them do." Suddenly, the church seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Roger's hand tightened on his rifle, and I knew he was feeling it too. "We need to go," Roger said firmly, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We backed out of the church, never taking our eyes off the man. He remained standing there, staring at the empty corner as if expecting something or someone to appear. As we stepped outside, the oppressive silence of the town returned, but this time it felt even heavier, more suffocating. "What the hell was that?" Roger muttered under his breath as we quickly made our way back toward the hotel. "I don't know," I replied, still trying to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my bones. "But something's wrong with this place. Something's keeping them here." When we regrouped with the others later, that afternoon, it became clear that we weren't the only ones experiencing strange things. Sam and Frank had stumbled upon a group of children playing in the ruins of a school, but when they tried to approach, the children vanished like ghosts disappearing into thin air. Charlie and Paul had found an old cafe, still filled with tables and chairs as if waiting for customers that would never come. But the strange part, there were freshly served cups of coffee on some of the tables still warm. "Something's not right," Frank said, his voice low. "It's like this whole town is stuck in the past, waiting for something. Waiting for us." We all knew what he meant, but no one wanted to say it. The dead here, they weren't at peace, and for some reason, they were still lingering, trapped in a place that time had forgotten. That night, back at the hotel, none of us could sleep. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the sounds of footsteps echoed in the hallways, footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. The dead, it seemed, weren't just lingering, they were watching. The second day in the haunted town brings more eerie encounters for the soldiers. As they patrol the streets, they discover that the town is not entirely abandoned. Inside a church, they meet a strange man who claims his family is still there, even though they're long gone. The soldiers begin to realize that the dead in this town not resting, and their spirits seem to be trapped, unaware that they've perished. The tension rises as the soldiers prepare for another sleepless night, with the unsettling realization that they are being watched by the ghosts of the town. The third day in that forsaken town felt different, colder somehow, as if the air itself carried the weight of the forgotten souls lingering around us. None of us had slept much the previous night. How could we, with the constant sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways of the hotel? Every creak, every whisper of wind outside, sent chills down our spines. After another uneasy breakfast, we gathered for the day's mission. Our orders were simple: explore the eastern part of the town and secure a path to the nearby river. But after what we'd experienced so far, I knew nothing in this town was simple. The sky above remained overcast, casting a gray pallor over the town as we made our way down the narrow, broken streets. Roger and Frank were on edge, and so was I. It wasn't just the mission, it was the town itself. The longer we stayed, the more the silence seemed to grow, pressing down on us like a physical force. As we walked, we passed rows of dilapidated houses, their windows broken, their doors swinging open with a soft creak as the occasional breeze passed through. It was as if the town was still breathing, even though it was long dead. But the worst part wasn't the silence, it was the feeling of being watched. I glanced at Roger, who was scanning the area with his rifle ready. "You feel that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He nodded without looking at me. "Yeah, they're still here." None of us said it aloud, but we all knew what Roger meant: the dead. They were still watching us, lingering in the shadows, waiting for something. Maybe for us to leave, or maybe for us to join them. We reached the edge of the town by noon, where the forest began to take over, creeping in around the broken buildings like a living thing. The river we were supposed to secure was just beyond the trees, but something in me, something primal, didn't want to go into that forest. We stopped to take a break near an old, crumbling statue in what must have once been a park. Frank sat down on a bench, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, staring at the abandoned swings swaying softly in the breeze. "Feels like the whole town's been watching us since we got here." I couldn't disagree. There was something off about the town, something that went beyond the destruction and decay. It was the way it seemed frozen in time, as if the war had ended, but the people had never left, as if they were still waiting for the fighting to stop, not realizing they had already lost. "Let's move," Roger said after a few minutes, breaking the heavy silence. "The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get out of here." We started towards the forest, the trees looming like dark sentinels ahead of us. The ground underfoot became softer, the dirt giving way to thick moss and overgrown roots. The deeper we went, the darker it became, the thick canopy above blocking out what little light the overcast sky provided. As we moved, I heard something faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of voices, not just one, but several, speaking in hushed tones. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Roger and Frank stopped as well, listening. The voices were faint, just barely audible, as if they were coming from all around us. And then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped. "Where's that coming from?" Frank asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," Roger replied, scanning the trees, "but we're not alone out here." We pushed forward, moving faster now, but the deeper we went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and every now and then I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure darting behind a tree, or a shadow moving through the underbrush. And then we found it. The remnants of what looked like an old, abandoned campsite. It was nothing more than a few broken tents and a rusted-out jeep, half buried in the dirt. But there was something wrong about the site. It was too quiet, too still. Roger and Frank spread out, checking the area while I stood near the old jeep, staring at the remnants of a fire pit. There was something strange about it, something I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence, a twig snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick and light, moving through the trees. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was no one there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. "We need to go," Roger said, his voice slow but urgent. Now, we didn't argue. We quickly made our way back through the forest, moving as fast as we could without breaking into a full run. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every step we took, there was a corresponding sound just behind us, footsteps, rustling leaves, the occasional whisper. By the time we emerged from the trees and back into the town, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I was drenched in sweat. Roger and Frank looked just as shaken. "What the hell was that?" Frank asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," Roger replied, staring back at the trees. "But whatever it was, it didn't want us there." We returned to the hotel in silence, the weight of what we had experienced pressing down on us. That night, the sounds returned, the footsteps in the hallway, the soft whispers just beyond the door. But this time, I couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't just the ghosts of the town we were hearing. Maybe, just maybe, we had brought something back with us from the forest. As the soldiers explore the eerie town, they venture into the forest on the outskirts and discover an abandoned campsite. Throughout their journey, they experience strange and unsettling phenomena, including faint voices and the feeling of being watched. The forest, dense and ominous, seems alive with unseen eyes, and the deeper they go, the more they realize they are not alone. After a chilling encounter, the soldiers rushed back to the town, only to be haunted by the sense that something has followed them back. The fourth day in that haunted town began with an unsettling calm. The morning light, muted by the perpetual gray clouds, cast long shadows across the broken streets. There was no wind, no sound, just an eerie stillness, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. After the unnerving encounter in the forest the day before, Roger, Frank, and I were hesitant to go back out. But orders were orders, and we had to finish what we started. Our mission that day was to survey the southern part of the town, an area that had seen some of the worst fighting during the war. We had heard stories from the local stories about entire squads that had disappeared without a trace in that part of town, but we didn't have a choice. We gathered our gear and headed out. The streets we walked down now were narrower, more enclosed, with the crumbling walls of old houses looming over us on both sides. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional sound of debris crunching under our boots. As we passed through a particularly narrow alley, something caught my eye, a faint movement in the corner of my vision. I stopped, my heart pounding, and turned to look. There, at the end of the alley, stood a figure. It was hazy, almost translucent, like it was made of smoke. It was a man, dressed in tattered military fatigues, staring straight at me with hollow eyes. "Roger, Frank," I whispered, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. "Do you see that?" They both turned, their expressions hardening as they saw the figure too. But before we could react, the figure dissolved into the air, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "What the hell was that?" Frank muttered, his voice tense. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not the first time I've seen something like that." We continued down the street, our nerves on edge. The town felt more alive now, but not in a good way. There was a heaviness in the air, like we were walking through something thick and invisible. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting behind buildings, figures standing just out of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. We reached the southern part of the town by midday. This area had been hit hard during the war. The buildings here weren't just crumbling, they were obliterated, reduced to piles of rubble and ash. The streets were strewn with the remnants of lives long gone, broken furniture, rusted bicycles, shattered windows. And then there were the bodies. Most of the corpses had long since decayed, but their skeletal remains were still there, lying in the streets, in the doorways, in the houses. Some were draped in tattered civilian clothes, others in what was left of military uniforms. It was a chilling reminder of the violence that had torn through this place. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by living people, but by the dead. It felt like their eyes were on us, judging us, blaming us for the destruction that had claimed their lives. We made our way to an old church that had been partially destroyed by a mortar strike. The bell tower was still standing, though just barely, and the front doors hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the pews were overturned, and the altar was shattered, but the building still had an eerie sense of sanctity about it. "Let's take a break here," Roger suggested, his voice tight with exhaustion. We sat down on the steps outside, drinking water and catching our breath. The silence around us was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the church's old wood settling. But then, I heard something else. A voice. At first, it was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as I listened, it grew louder. It was a woman's voice, singing softly a haunting, melancholic melody that seemed to float through the air. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Roger and Frank both nodded, their faces pale. "It's coming from inside the church," Frank whispered. We stood up slowly, our weapons at the ready, and stepped back into the church. The singing was louder now, echoing off the broken walls, but there was no one there. The church was empty, save for the dust and debris that had accumulated over the years. And yet, the voice continued. It wasn't until I looked towards the altar that I saw her. She was standing there, behind the shattered altar, her back to us. She was dressed in a simple white gown, her long hair cascading down her back. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. She just stood there, singing that same mournful song. "Who is that?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. Roger, always the most composed of us, took a step forward. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. The woman stopped singing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then, slowly, she turned around. Her face was pale, like the life had been drained from it. Her eyes were hollow, empty, staring straight through us. And then she smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down my spine. Without a word, she vanished, dissolving into the air, just like the figure in the alley. We stood there in stunned silence, too shocked to move or speak. The only sound was the echo of her song, lingering in the air like a ghost of its own. "What the hell is going on in this town?" Roger muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there fast. We left the church and made our way back through the ruined streets, the weight of the town's past pressing down on us with every step. The dead were all around us now, not just in the bodies that littered the streets, but in the shadows that followed us, in the whispers that echoed through the air, in the ghosts that refused to rest. And as we walked, I couldn't help but feel that we were walking in the footsteps of the forgotten, retracing the last moments of lives lost to the horrors of war. The soldiers venture into the southern part of the town, a place devastated by the war, where the dead still seem to linger. As they encounter strange apparitions and hear haunting voices, they find themselves facing not only the physical remnants of the war, but also the restless spirits of those who perished. Their journey takes them to a ruined church where they come face to face with a ghostly woman, leaving them shaken and desperate to escape the town's oppressive grip. We left the church behind, but its chilling presence seemed to follow us. The woman's eerie smile haunted my thoughts as we moved deeper into the southern part of the town. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on all of us. It was as if the very air we breathed was filled with the whispers of those who had died there, and we were intruding on their domain. The buildings around us had been reduced to little more than skeletal remains, like the ruins of a forgotten civilization. Burnt-out vehicles lay scattered in the streets, their rusted frames like tombstones, marking the final resting places of their passengers. Even the trees seemed to have died, their blackened branches stretching toward the sky like fingers grasping at something just out of reach. As we walked, I noticed that Roger had gone quiet. He was normally the one to keep us grounded, to crack a joke when things got tense. But now, he looked lost in thought, his brow furrowed as he stared straight ahead. "Roger, you all right?" I asked, my voice breaking the uneasy silence. He glanced at me, his face pale. "I don't know, man. Something's off about this place. I keep feeling like we're not alone." Frank nodded in agreement, his eyes darting to the shadows. "It's like they're watching us, waiting for something." I couldn't disagree. Every step we took felt like we were being pulled deeper into a nightmare. The shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond the corners of our vision, and strange noises echoed through the broken streets, slow whispers, the creaking of unseen doors, the faint sound of footsteps that never seemed to come from the same direction twice. We were heading toward the outskirts of the town now, to an old watchtower that had once been used as a military outpost. The place had been abandoned for years, but it still stood tall, looming over the crumbled landscape like a silent sentinel. Our mission was to secure the area and set up a temporary observation post, but as we approached the tower, I could feel a growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. When we reached the base of the tower, we found the entrance partially blocked by debris. We had to clear a path for us to get inside. The inside was as desolate as the rest of the town: broken furniture, shattered glass, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. They were old, faded photographs pinned to one of the walls. They were black and white images of soldiers from the war, young men, their faces hard and serious, their eyes filled with a grim determination. But it wasn't the photographs themselves that disturbed me. It was the fact that someone had scrawled over them with red paint, writing words I couldn't understand in a language I didn't recognize. "Who the hell put these here?" Frank muttered, stepping closer to inspect the photos. "This place has been abandoned for years. There shouldn't be anything like this left." Roger shook his head, his face pale. "I don't like this. We should set up camp and get out of here as soon as we can." We made our way up the stairs to the top of the watchtower, where the view of the town stretched out before us. From up there, we could see the full extent of the devastation: whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, streets that led nowhere, and the forest beyond, its dark trees standing like a barrier between the town and the rest of the world. As we settled in for the night, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. The sense of being watched never left us. Every noise, every creak of the building, made my heart race. "Do you think they know they're dead?" Frank asked suddenly, his voice quiet. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew what he was talking about. "The people, the soldiers, the ones who died here. Do you think they know what happened to them? Or are they just stuck here, wandering around, not even realizing it?" Roger didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We had all been thinking the same thing about the ghostly figures we had seen, about the woman in the church. Were they trapped here, unaware that the war had ended and their lives had been cut short? Before I could answer, we heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the floor below us. It was faint at first, like someone knocking lightly on wood, but it grew louder with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" Roger whispered, his hand gripping his rifle. We all stood up, weapons at the ready, and slowly made our way down the stairs. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, leading us toward the room where we had seen the photographs. As we stepped into the room, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving us in silence. And then we saw it. The photographs had changed. The soldiers in the pictures, they were no longer just images. Their faces had shifted, their expressions twisted into grotesque parodies of pain and fear. Their eyes, once filled with determination, were now hollow and dark, staring out at us with a terrible emptiness. "What then?" Frank breathed, taking a step back. As we stood there, frozen in shock, the tapping started again, this time from right behind us. We spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the broken furniture and the photographs on the wall. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen standing just inches away, was overwhelming. "We need to leave," Roger said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" We didn't argue. We grabbed our gear and bolted out of the watchtower, the sound of the tapping following us as we ran. It wasn't until we were halfway back to our base that the noise finally stopped, leaving us in an unsettling silence. As we made camp that night, none of us spoke. The weight of what we had experienced hung over us like a dark cloud. The town, the watchtower, the photographs, it all felt like a terrible reminder of the war's lingering presence. And as I lay there, staring up at the night sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. That the ghosts of the past weren't just memories, they were still here, trapped in the ruins of a town that had long since been forgotten by the living. The soldiers venture to a watchtower on the outskirts of the town, where they encounter strange and unsettling phenomena. The abandoned tower, filled with eerie photographs of soldiers from the past, seems to be haunted by the spirits of those who died during the war. As the soldiers experience inexplicable events, including the eerie sound of tapping and changing images in the photographs, they realize that the ghosts of the war-torn town are very much alive, still trapped in the devastation. We left the watchtower far behind, but the fear lingered with us like a thick fog, clinging to every thought. No one spoke much as we made our way through the deserted streets, our eyes constantly scanning the ruins, waiting for anything to jump out from the shadows. The oppressive atmosphere that hung over the town felt heavier with every step, as though the very ground beneath our feet was alive with memories of the dead. It was our third and final night in this forsaken town. We had planned to head back to base at dawn, but none of us felt the relief we should have. Something was wrong here, something we couldn't explain or escape. We found a relatively intact house to set up camp for the night. It was a small, dilapidated structure on the edge of town, with boarded-up windows and a partially collapsed roof. It wasn't ideal, but it would give us some shelter from the elements and, hopefully, from whatever else was out there. As we entered, I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound you make. The wooden floorboards creaked under our boots, and the air inside was stale, as if no one had stepped foot in there for years. Yet, something about the place felt lived in, like we weren't the first to take refuge here. "Let's set up here for the night," Roger said, his voice low. He glanced around the dimly lit room, his face tense with worrying. "We'll take turns keeping watch. We leave at first light." Frank and I nodded, silently agreeing. None of us wanted to spend more time here than we had to. As we unpacked our gear, I noticed something strange. There were faded, almost invisible scratches on the walls like marks made by fingernails. Long, deep grooves that ran from the floor to the ceiling, as if someone or something had desperately clawed at the walls in an attempt to escape. "Guys, look at this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Roger and Frank came over, their expressions darkening as they saw the scratches. Frank ran his hand over the marks, his fingers trembling slightly. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. Before we could dwell on it further, we heard it again, the tapping. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of the old house. But, as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent. It was the same sound we had heard back at the watchtower, but this time it felt closer, much closer. "Everyone stay alert," Roger ordered, his voice tight with fear. We stood there, weapons in hand, our eyes darting from one dark corner of the room to another. The tapping continued, a slow, rhythmic knock, as if someone or something was knocking on the door, asking to be let in. But the door was shut, and there was no one there. "What the hell is going on?" Frank hissed, his eyes wide with panic. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was worse. It was as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. "Did you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the far end of the room. Roger and Frank turned to look, their faces pale. There, just beyond the edge of the light cast by our lantern, was a shadow. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if it was watching us. My heart raced as the figure seemed to take shape, a soldier, dressed in the tattered uniform of someone long dead. His face was obscured, but I could see enough to know he wasn't alive. His body was translucent, almost like mist, and his eyes, if he had any, were locked on us. "Back away, slowly," Roger whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't provoke it." We all took a step back, our breaths shallow, our minds racing. The ghostly figure didn't move at first, it just stood there, staring. But then, it began to drift toward us. Its steps slow and deliberate, the air around it growing colder with every inch it advanced. "We need to get out of here," Frank stammered, his eyes wide with fear. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the force of it shaking the entire room. The tapping started again, louder this time, more frantic, as though the entire house had come alive with the spirits of the dead. "We're trapped," Roger yelled, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of the knocks. "Find another way out." We scrambled toward the windows, but they were boarded up too tightly. There was no way to break through. Panic set in as the temperature dropped even further, our breath turning to mist in the freezing air. The ghost was closer now, so close that I could see the faint outline of his features. His face was twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent scream. And behind him, more figures appeared, dozens of them, all soldiers, all staring at us with eyes full of pain and desperation. "Help us," a voice whispered, soft but unmistakable. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Just the shadows and the ghosts, pressing in on us from all sides. "Help us," the voice came again, louder this time, and I realized with horror that it wasn't coming from outside, it was in my head, echoing through my thoughts like a terrible, haunting plea. "We can't stay here," Roger shouted, his voice shaking with terror. "We need to go now." But before we could make a move, the floor beneath us creaked loudly, and then, without warning, it gave way. The wood splintered and broke apart, sending us tumbling into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, everything was a blur, the sound of wood cracking, the cold bite of the air, the distant echo of the tapping that still hadn't stopped. When I finally caught my breath, I looked around. We had fallen into what appeared to be an old cellar, its walls lined with decaying wood and debris. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the faint glow of our lantern, which had somehow survived the fall. But we weren't alone. In the dim light, I could see them, the ghosts. They surrounded us, their faces twisted in pain, their bodies flickering like old film reels, trapped between this world and the next. "Help us," one of them whispered again, his voice a broken, desperate plea. "We don't belong here," Frank whimpered, his face pale with terror. "We shouldn't have come." But it was too late. The spirits had found us, and there was no escaping their wrath. As the cold, ghostly hands reached out toward us, I knew that we had disturbed something far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.